From ABC, this is World News Tonight. Reporting from Washington, Peter Jennings.
Good evening, everyone, but the Soviet Union says the Soviets did shoot down a Korean 747. 269 passengers and a crew were on board, and in the absence of any wreckage, we can only assume their fate. We begin with our Pentagon correspondent, John McCrethie, who tells us how it all began.
According to various government accounts, the plane began straying off course near the Kamchatka Peninsula, Soviet territory.
What you've just seen is a newscast which aired September 1st, 1983. Was that the news, or was it just one view of the news? When we turn on our TVs tonight or open our newspapers tomorrow, will we be finding out what really happened, or will we be getting only a particular version of today's events? And whichever it is, how will it affect the way we think about America's relationship to the rest of the world? Does the news media simply report, or does it actually shape foreign policy?
Hello, I'm Patsy Wiggins. These questions and more were on the agenda when 250 people met in the winter of 1989 for a conference on the media and foreign affairs. They met here in Camden, Maine. It is a harbor town with a centuries-old tradition of international relations growing out of the tall ships that sailed from here to ports around the world.
The U.S. Navy on the move. 2 carrier battle groups.
When a major event breaks, we hear about it through the news media. And what we hear, quite naturally, has a significant impact on what we think our government ought to do about it. But depending on the nature of the event, the news stories we get may be long or short, simplified or detailed, emotionally powerful, or merely superficial. But that is not to say that the news media makes the news.
First of all, it's clear that the media hardly creates our reality, but it does structure it.
Professor Dennis Driscoll studies how international media reports the news.
The media did not sabotage the Pan Am plane in Scotland, it simply reported it. The media doesn't conduct terrorist attacks, it simply reports them. But the way the media chooses to tell a story does structure, for most of us, our sense of the world and our sense of reality.
How does the media structure reality? Professor Driscoll likes to contrast the news accounts of the shoot-down of the Korean airliner with an earlier incident involving the Israeli downing of a Libyan airliner. Both planes were full of people. Both events involved massive loss of life. But one of the planes was shot down by an American ally, Israel, the other by an adversary, the Soviet Union.
It seemed to me the media simply reflected the government's agenda. There was, in one case, the Soviet shoot-down, the United States taking the high moral ground because they thought it showed quite clearly the sort of people the Soviets are. And they put on a massive information campaign. The other event is eminently forgettable. I gave a presentation on the shoot-downs a couple of years ago at Harvard. Half the audience were Middle East specialists, and they had forgotten the Israelis had done such a thing.
John Hughes was State Department spokesman for Secretary of State George Shultz at the time of the Korean airliner shoot-down.
I happened to be with George Shultz when he got the first news. His edict was that we should communicate as much as possible, as fast as possible, as the story unraveled. And that we did. Shultz is a man who really cares about human life, and he just found this conduct unconscionable. So he was very strong. Normally he's a very calm man, but it was clear that he was angry. His instructions were that the information was to be made available as fast as it could be made available, even when it offered negative aspects of the story.
What Shultz did not know at that time is that an American spy plane had been in the area earlier, and that the Soviet pilots may have mistaken the Korean airliner for an American spy plane.
We now understand that the Soviets thought they were shooting down an American spy plane, and indeed, within, I think, about 10 days of the shoot-down, that information was on the president's desk.
That information was based partly on an intensive analysis of the conversations between the Soviet fighter pilots. And when that analysis hit Shultz's desk, he made it public. But Professor Driscoll, after studying the American coverage of that event in the following days, says that television news almost entirely ignored this new interpretation of the Soviet motives.
only one network in 3 took the trouble to say to its viewers, the Soviets did not really shoot down calculatedly a civilian airliner.
Why didn't the networks report the new information? Perhaps it was because of a shortage of time, or a feeling that a week or two after the shoot-down, other stories were more important. Perhaps because it was simpler to let the public go on thinking that the Soviets were the ruthless villains than it was to develop the more complex and subtle nuances of the story. Whatever the reason, one thing is certain. The news we get is not simply the facts, but always somebody's views of the facts. Why is that? New York Times executive Seymour Topping, who spent many years as a foreign correspondent, points out that there's a need to clarify the function of the press.
We are not historians, and we shouldn't pretend to be historians. Our function is that of being the scouts out far in advance of the historians, gathering up material, meeting a whole different set of needs.
Those needs are those of the reading and viewing public, which wants immediate understanding of the events of the world. But those events are increasingly complex, says Philip Foisey.
We're becoming aware of the complexity of life now. It's not just that as well as the fact that it is becoming more complex. One of the things this means is that it becomes increasingly difficult for the journalists to fathom these issues, report them accurately, and explain them adequately in the given space and time we have, and of course to make them comprehensible to the leaders, to the listeners and the readers.
But others blame the media itself.
I just want to say one final word, however, about television. Television news coverage, which I do think does complicate the formulation and pursuit of foreign policy. Television does many things well, but it also simplifies, it exaggerates, and it freezes moments in history, it seems to me, without perspective. The problem with television is that it is understandably concerned more with images than ideas. Print newspapers tend to be more concerned with ideas, and there's very little capacity in television news for correction or amplification.
But former network television producer Edward Fooey takes a different view.
There's something about television that makes us all want to hate it. I guess that's because it's when it's good, it's so very, very good, but those good moments are rare, and they make us yearn for more and deplore those that aren't.
In its coverage of foreign affairs, however, television news does a fairly good job. Studies of television show that the content of evening news programs is typically about 40% foreign affairs.
That proportionally is more foreign news than most of our best newspapers print, and about 4 times as much as most provincial newspapers carry. The public gets its information from television. Foreign policy establishment may not like that, but it's a fact. Most people get most of their news from television, and when there are conflicting versions of the same story, the majority, according to current surveys, will believe what they see on television.
Yet, as we have just seen in the cases of the Korean and Iranian airliner shoot-downs, what the public sees on television may not be the news, or at least not all of the news. Why does it matter whether we're getting the news or only one view of the news? Because in a democracy, our national policies are shaped under the pressure of public opinion. And public opinion is shaped by the citizens' access to information. The better the information, the clearer our national policies, especially our foreign policy. Foreign policy used to be considered almost an abstraction, or at least very far removed from daily life. Increasingly, however, the decisions made in foreign countries have direct bearing on our lives. Many of the things we decide to buy for our homes and businesses are imports. Even in America's smaller towns, we're buying wallpaper from Belgium, snow shovels from Canada, cookware from Korea, woodenware from Thailand, custard cups from France, spatulas from Brazil, ice augers from Sweden, candles from Macau, and even automatic dog leashes from West Germany. How do we pay for all of this? Perhaps with money that has earned interest down at the local bank. But that interest rate moves up and down, in part because of the value of the dollar on foreign markets. What we can spend today, in other words, is affected by decisions made yesterday in foreign capitals. And those decisions, in turn, are affected by American decisions about those countries. Who makes the decisions? The administration and Congress. Who influences them? The voters.
In the United States, public opinion has, more so than any Western country, I think, a great role to play in the making of foreign policy.
That public opinion is shaped in large part by the news media. So does the news media actually help shape foreign policy?
My answer is a qualified you bet. Editorials do not, of course, change the basic history that has created the problem at issue, but editorials can certainly change the political context in which an issue is being discussed and decided.
Well, what is the impact of press on government and foreign policy? It's awesome. The first couple of hours in Washington, government is paralyzed discussing the impact of last night's network news broadcasts and what's in this morning's newspapers, and deciding how government should comport itself during the day as a result. Columnists have more influence in Washington than in any other capital I know. They may not end up changing policy, but they certainly have input.
Sometimes the press can actually add impetus to foreign policy, such as we recently saw in the tracking of the release of information about chemical and biological warfare.
Bill Baker is chief spokesman for the Central Intelligence Agency in Washington. He was in Libya in September 1988 when the State Department first accused the Libyans of preparing to manufacture chemical weapons. In October 1988, CIA Director William Webster added more details in public speeches.
The press picked up on it. Gary Thatcher with the Christian Science Monitor wrote a very detailed piece that helped focus attention. The New York Times and other newspapers added foreign companies and helped our policy, which was one to deny continued support to Libya in this area.
So the press sometimes takes the government side and sometimes takes issue with it. Whichever it is, however, the relationship between the government and the press is an important one, especially if the public is to get the news rather than simply views.
Fred Hoffman, spokesman for the Defense Department in Washington, has been a journalist for 40 years and a government official for the last 4 years. He knows that some tension between the government and the press is necessary, but he worries about the present trends.
Obviously, skepticism is a basic requirement of any good newsman. It is now, it always has been. What disturbs me is I find in the last 20 years that the trend has been to move beyond skepticism into cynicism.
Former network correspondent and State Department spokesman Bernard Kalb makes the same point.
There has to be a strengthening of confidence. All of us in this room, I suspect, are old enough to remember the nature of trust of once upon a time between people in government and the press in government. But the chasm of skepticism rotting into cynicism, the chasm turning into a crevasse. I'm thinking of the first major roots of the ailment, Vietnam. I'm thinking the way it was fattened and thickened by the deceptions of Watergate. The hypocrisy and the duplicity of the Iran-Contra scandal only compounded it. And there was a time when this was not the case. But to what degree, answer the questions for yourself, to what degree is there instant trust, instant faith in what the government says? What happens when we're in a theater and Uncle Sam stands up and yells, "Fire"?
My name is Peter Orn. I'm a student, and frankly, I don't remember the days when the press was honest. And throughout this conference, I've been wondering about the ambiguity of the press, and I'm wondering how that's affected my whole attitude about this country. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on that.
I'm not standing here with some sort of a megaphone to give straight A's to the press. You heard me talk before how they failed, absolutely failed, in the Iran-Contra, in the uncovering of the Iran-Contra scandal. And I talked about raised voices, and I talked about the failure to pursue on certain questions during the campaign. But if you do the arithmetic altogether, we are getting more information today than the United States public has ever gotten before. And I must say that certainly in certain areas, the press has never been better, even with the shortcomings I'm prepared to list, and it has never seems to have been under such severe criticism.
No question about it. There is a lot of criticism about the press these days. David Annable, who is the former managing editor of the Christian Science Monitor and now head of the journalism department at Boston University, has heard a lot of it. But he says there is also a lot of good journalism.
I was a little concerned with some of the questions yesterday, which sort of implied a certain degree of suspicion of the media. The press, I find this very hard to understand. And I thought somebody needs to say loud and clear that the press, the media, have a useful job to do, and a huge majority of those who are doing it are trying their very best to uphold the highest possible standards. It may sound something rather strange to have to say it at all, but I think perhaps it does need to be said, particularly for the younger generation. But the great majority of journalists are highly conscientious people, very professional, very hardworking, very concerned about ethics. And in the profession right now, there's a great debate going on about how to improve journalistic ethics and how to do a better job. And I think it's certainly true, looking back historically, that the journalist of today is a great deal more ethical woman or man than the journalist of some 50 or 100 years ago. So I think we have made some progress, and I just wanted to say that to start off with.
As Annable sees it, one of the central tasks of an editor is in making choices about what does or doesn't get reported.
The better the editor and his reporters, the better job they do of selecting what you need to know. The essence of being a good editor is to select what people need to know and make them want to know it.
I have a question for David Annable. You stated in your introduction that it is the responsibility of the media to present facts as the media perceives the facts, and we've just been talking about whether they're right or wrong, to the public, even when the public doesn't feel any great need to know and probably doesn't even want to know.
I love the question. An excellent question. The answer is very simple. I have spent 23 years until a few months ago working on the Christian Science Monitor, which tried very, very hard to inform people accurately about issues all around the world and all around this country, and tried simultaneously to increase its circulation. And what you find is that people very often simply do not want to have things which are difficult to understand. They would rather read or see or hear that which is easily appeals to their feelings or to their senses or to their lack of knowledge. Because the United States is so self-sufficient, or has been traditionally, it has a tendency not to be that concerned about how other people live, how they think, how they feel. And I hate to tell you, it's not just an elitist journalistic thing, it's a fact. And it means that it's very hard for high-quality programming or high-quality newspapers or high-quality magazines to have anything but a very small circulation.
Reporting the news accurately is a difficult business, especially foreign news. That's because the news doesn't exist somewhere out there. It grows up out of hundreds of decisions made every hour by editors and reporters. Those decisions shape public opinion. Public opinion shapes governmental policy. And that policy helps shape the very news events that the media reports. The media, public opinion, governmental policy, these three are tightly linked in the great circle of information that drives American foreign policy. It has been said that a nation gets the foreign policy and the news reporting it deserves. So we have a role to play. The more we read, listen, and understand, the more we too can help shape American media and foreign policy for the better.